The clap of thunder split the inky black sky, a roar that seemed to scream in, quote, unison with the cruelty unfolding in a modest suburban house on the edge of the city. Rain fell in a relentless driving sheet, a curtain of water that blurred the world. But it wasn't enough to drown out the furious shouts of an enraged man. The front door of the house flew open, its hinges groaning in protest. A frail figure was shoved violently outside, stumbling onto the slick, wet porch. Sarah struggled to keep her balance, her body trembling uncontrollably. She clutched a Blake-tan bundle of blankets to her chest, shielding it from the wind-whipped rain. Inside the blankets, a tiny baby, only 3 days old, was wailing. His cries a heartbreaking soundtrack to the raging storm. Mark stood in the doorway, his face a mask of crimson fury. His eyes blazed with a cold fire as he glared at his wife, now shivering in the downpour. Without a shred of mercy, he hurled a big, large duffel bag full of clothes onto the front lawn. The bag landed with a sickening squelch in a mud puddle, its contents instantly soiled. Sarah stared at the bag, then back at her husband, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. A sharp, searing pain shot through her lower abdomen. The stitches from the C-section she'd had just 3 days ago felt like they were being ripped apart, but the physical agony was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. To see the man who once promised to protect her now treating her worse than an animal was a torture beyond words. Mark jabbed a trembling finger in her face. He screamed that he never wanted to see her or the child in her arms again. He accused her of infidelity, roaring that the baby wasn't his. He yelled that the baby's face looked nothing like his, but instead resembled some other man he accused Sarah of seeing. The accusation was so vile, so baseless, it stole the lard and crad air from Sarah's lungs. She took a staggering step forward, begging Mark to listen, to let her explain. She swore on her life there had never been another man, that Leo was his son. But every word she spoke was met with a louder, more furious tirade. Mark covered his ears, refusing to listen. Sarah pleaded, not for herself, but for Leo. The baby was too new, too fragile to be out in this freezing storm. She begged Mark for a shred of compassion, to let them stay on the porch until the rain subsided, or at least to let Leo stay inside. But Mark's heart was a stone. He slammed the iron gate shut and locked it from the inside. He spat that he didn't care if they froze to death. To him, Sarah and the baby were bad luck, a stain to be washed away. After unleashing a final torrent of curses, he turned, stormed back into the house, and slammed the front door shut. The porch light clicked off, plunging Sarah into a darkness, punctuated only by the occasional flash of lightning. She was utterly alone, soaked from her hair to the hem of her long dress, which grew heavy with water, making it even harder to move. She painfully retrieved the duffel bag from the mud, slinging it over the shoulder that wasn't supporting her baby's head. With a limp from the agonizing pain in her abdomen, Sarah began to walk away from the yard of the house that had been her home for the past year. Every step was an ordeal. The pain radiated to her back, forcing her to walk hunched over. She kept whispering reassurances to the crying Leo, promising they would find shelter soon, though she had no idea where they could possibly go. The streets of the housing development were deserted. The storm had driven everyone indoors, to the warmth and comfort of their beds, oblivious to the Fryans' young mother's life or death struggle outside. Sarah walked along the cracked sidewalk, her feet stumbling on uneven pavement and splashing into icy puddles. She had no cash. Her wallet was in the house, and Mark had let her take nothing but some old clothes. Her phone was dead. She was completely cut off. Dark thoughts swirled in her mind. What if her stitches tore open? What if Leo got hypothermia? Fear propelled her forward, even as her legs felt ready to collapse. After walking for nearly a mile, she reached the main highway. It was wider, but just as desolate. The dim glow of the streetlights created an eerie, menacing atmosphere. The few cars that passed sped by, their drivers indifferent. To the lone figure on the roadside, Sarah felt a wave of dizziness. Her vision swam with black spots from exhaustion, hunger, and unbearable pain. She hadn't eaten since noon, too busy with a fussy Leo. Now, her energy was completely gone. She was about to give up, to sit down at the empty bus stop, just to rest her legs. But she knew the biting wind was a danger to her son. She had to keep moving. Suddenly, the bright glare of headlights washed over her from behind. Sarah moved to the side of the road, assuming the car would just pass. But it slowed down. A sleek, black luxury sedan crawled alongside her, matching her pained, shuffling pace. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. A predator, she thought, looking for a victim. In the middle of the night, in a storm like this, who would stop for a stranger? She clutched Leo tighter and tried to walk faster, her limp more pronounced. The car continued to follow before finally pulling to a stop a few feet ahead, blocking her path. The rear passenger door swung open. Sarah took a wary step back. An elderly woman, looking impossibly elegant, stepped out of the car. Despite her age, she paid no mind to the rain that immediately began soaking her expensive coat. She walked towards Sarah with an expression that was hard to read, stern, yet with a flicker of maternal warmth in her eyes. "Why are you out here alone in the middle of the night like this?" The old woman's voice was strong, cutting through the sound of the rain. The simple question shattered Sarah's fragile composure. With lips trembling from cold and sorrow, she answered honestly, "My husband, he just threw me out. He said this baby, my son, is a curse, that he isn't his." She no longer had the strength to lie or protect Mark's reputation. She just needed help. Hearing this, the old woman's expression shifted. There was no surprise, as if she had expected this all along. She nodded slowly, then said a sentence that left Sarah stunned. "You are the one I've been looking for." Without further explanation, the woman instructed her to get in the car. "Come with me. I'm going to settle everything tonight." Sarah hesitated. She didn't know this woman, but one look at Leo, who had grown quiet, a silence far more frightening than his crying, made her realize she had no choice. Her son needed warmth. She gave a weak nod and let the old woman guide her into the plush, heated interior of the luxury car. What happened next was beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. This was no mere rescue. Inside the car, she saw a stack of files on the adjacent seat. Her eyes caught a photograph of Mark stapled to one of the documents. Confusion and fear swirled within her. But as her body sank into the soft leather seat, exhaustion began to claim her. Sarah didn't know it yet, but this meeting was no coincidence. Tonight would be the longest night of her life, and it would change everything forever. The air inside the luxury sedan was a world away from the storm outside. Warm, dry, and filled with a calming, expensive fragrance. Sarah leaned back, her body weak against the soft leather upholstery. A burly man in the front, Passenger seat turned and handed her a thick, clean towel. Sarah took it with trembling hands and immediately began to dry Leo, who stirred slightly, comforted by the returning warmth. Only after she was sure her baby was safe did she dry her own face and wet hair. The old woman sitting beside her watched her intently. Her gaze was sharp but no longer intimidating. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Vance. She was direct. In a clipped, authoritative tone, she began to explain things that made Sarah's head spin. Mrs. Vance said she knew exactly who Mark was. She explained that he wasn't the blank good man Sarah thought him to be. Mrs. Vance opened a first aid kit, pulling out antiseptic and bandages. She knew Sarah was in pain. Without a hint of revulsion, she gently cleaned the scrapes on Sarah's arms from when she'd been pushed. While Sarah was still trying to process this, Mrs. Vance dropped a bombshell. The reason Mark had thrown her out tonight wasn't a simple fit of rage or a baseless accusation. It was all a pretext, a calculated move to get Sarah out of and the house. The real reason was that Mark needed to be single, effective, immediately. Mrs. Vance revealed that at this very moment, Mark was on his way to a lavish event hall in the heart of downtown. A massive party was underway. It wasn't just any party. It was a celebration of a business deal and, simultaneously, Mark's engagement party to another woman, a woman named Jessica. Sarah felt her heart stop. Jessica. She had never heard that name. Mark had always come home on time, had always been sweet, even if he'd been short-tempered about money lately. She never suspected there was someone else. Fresh tears fell. This time not from physical pain, but from the raw wound of .com. Betrayal. Mrs. Vance handed her a tissue. Your tears are too precious to be wasted on a man like him, she said firmly. She explained that Jessica was the daughter of a business partner Mark claimed would bring him immense wealth. Mark had discarded Sarah and his son because he saw them as obstacles to his ambition, a barrier to climbing the social ladder. The car sped through the rain-slicked city streets. Where are you taking us? Sarah asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. To the party, Mrs. Vance replied simply. Sarah was shocked. No, I can't. Look at me. Her clothes were damp, her face pale, and she was carrying a newborn. She would be a laughingstock. She felt dirty, worthless, but Mrs. Vance looked her directly in the eyes. Tonight, you will not arrive as a victim begging for mercy, she said, her voice steely. You will arrive as the judge delivering the verdict. She assured Sarah that she possessed something that could shatter Mark's arrogance in an instant. Mrs. Vance retrieved a manila folder from her briefcase and handed it to Sarah. Sarah opened it hesitantly. Inside was an old yellowed property deed. She read the name of the owner listed. It was her late father's name. Sarah was confused. She thought her father had only left them the small house they'd had to sell years ago to cover her mother's medical bills. Mrs. Vance explained. The land described in that deed was no ordinary plot. It was the vast tract of land upon which now stood the very event hall where Mark's party was being held, as well as the land their suburban home was built on. For years, the deed had been hidden. The ownership, manipulated by Mark's family, without the knowledge of Sarah, who had been a young orphan child at the Bros to Sarah time. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. All this time, she had been living as a guest on her own property, treated like trash by the very people who had stolen her birthright. Sadness slowly curdled into a cold, hard rage. Mrs. Vance saw the shift in Sarah's expression and gave a faint, satisfied smile. This was what she wanted. She didn't need a weak woman who could only cry. She needed a strong woman, ready to reclaim what was hers. Mrs. Vance pressed the intercom button. "Faster, James," she commanded the driver. "We need to get there before he puts a ring on her finger." A few minutes later, the car turned into the glittering, chandelier-lit entryway of a magnificent building. A line of luxury cars idled, waiting for the valet. Security guards sternly waved away any vehicle that didn't belong. But when they saw Mrs. Vance's sedan approach, their demeanor changed instantly. A guard bowed respectfully and jogged over to open her door, ignoring the other waiting guests. Sarah felt a surge of anxiety, looking down at her still damp dress. Mrs. Vance patted her hand reassuringly. In the back of the spacious car, a box was waiting. It contained a change of clothes. With the privacy screens raised, Sarah changed into a simple but elegant long dress and a clean new scarf. She wore no flashy jewelry, but her entire aura transformed. Her pale face now gave her an air of cold, mysterious purpose. Mrs. Vance nodded in approval. She had her assistant retrieve a wheelchair from the trunk. Sarah was still too weak to walk far, and Mrs. Vance wanted to ensure she entered with her head held high, not limping in pain. As the automatic glass doors to the lobby slid open, the faint sound of a piano drifted from the grand ballroom. Mrs. Vance signaled for her assistant to push Sarah's wheelchair. Sarah cradled Leo, now sleeping soundly in a thick, warm blanket. Her heart pounded as the wheels glided across the polished marble floor. At the end of the corridor, the grand double doors to the ballroom were closed. Behind them, Mark was laughing, celebrating on the ruins of his wife and son's lives. Mrs. Vance walked beside Sarah, her posture ramrod straight. She whispered one final sentence before the doors were opened. "Remember, Sarah, you own this place. Don't you dare bow your head to a thief." A uniformed attendant pulled open both massive doors, and the brilliant light from within flooded out, momentarily dazzling Sarah. A new chapter of her life was about to begin. The atmosphere inside the ballroom was one of staggering opulence. A gigantic crystal chandelier cast a golden glow over everything, reflecting off the frame, mirror-polished marble floor. Guests, a mix of business associates and distant relatives, mingled and enjoyed the lavish buffet spread across long, silk-draped tables. The clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter filled the air, creating a flawless facade of joy. At the center of the room, Mark stood on a small stage, looking dashing in a brand-new, expensive suit. Beside him stood Jessica, his beautiful, soon-to-be fiancée, shimmering in a sequined evening gown. Mark raised his champagne flute, his face beaming with triumph, as if he owned the world. He launched into a triumph welcome speech, his voice loud and confident. He spoke of his latest business success and his brilliant future. With a smug smile, he alluded to a major decision he'd just made, cleansing his life of a past burden that was holding him back. He subtly denigrated his previous marriage, calling it a mistake, and referred to Sarah as a parasite who did nothing but hold him down. The uninformed guests nodded along, laughing at his cruel jokes. Jessica smiled sweetly, holding his arm possessively. The picture of the woman who deserved to stand by his side. But the laughter and applause died abruptly when the main doors at the far end of the room swung open with a resounding thud. Every head turned. The orchestra music faded into an unnerving silence. Framed in the doorway was a scene that clashed violently with the party's luxury. Sarah sat in a wheelchair, pushed by a stone-faced assistant. Though her face was pale and her eyes swollen, she held her head high. She wore the simple, elegant dress Mrs. Vance had given her. On her lap, Leo slept peacefully, undisturbed by the sudden tension. Mark, on stage, froze. The glass nearly slipped from his hand. His triumphant flush drained away, leaving his face a sickly white. He never expected Sarah to show up here. He had imagined her crying on a street corner, soaked and miserable. Her presence here, looking composed and far from broken, sent a jolt of rage and humiliation through him. How dare the woman he'd just thrown out, like garbage, appear at the most important event of his life? Panic began to rise in his chest. His cruel secret was about to be exposed in front of the very business partners he had so carefully deceived with his image of a devoted family man. In a rush, Mark jumped off the stage and stormed toward Sarah, his face contorted in a furious scowl. He tried to mask his panic with an explosion of anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice boomed across the silent room. He pointed at her, accusing her of being a crazy, shameless woman. He yelled to the blank-ear guests that this woman in the wheelchair was a beggar trying to ruin his party. He screamed at her to get out before he called the police. He even had the Prarbaus audacity to claim that the child she held was the disgusting product of an affair, trying to paint a narrative that would make the guests recoil from her. Jessica, still on stage, looked confused but remained silent, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Seeing Sarah stare back at him with cold, empty eyes, Mark's rage spiraled. He spun around and bellowed for the head of security. A burly man in a crisp uniform hurried over. Mark smirked, certain that in a moment, Sarah would be dragged out and publicly shamed. "Get this trash out of here," he ordered the security chief. "Her and the baby. Throw them back on the street. Don't even let them stand on the steps." Mark felt powerful, believing he, as the client who had rented the hall, had absolute authority. But what happened next left Mark and every guest in the room speechless. The head of security didn't move towards Sarah. Instead, he walked right past Mark, as if he were invisible. He stopped directly in front of Sarah's wheelchair, then bowed deeply and respectfully. "Welcome, ma'am," the chief said, his voice clear and formal. "We are honored to have you, the owner of the building, here with us tonight." The words struck Mark like a bolt of lightning. He stood frozen, his mouth hanging open in shock. The owner? Sarah? It was impossible. She was a poor orphan with nothing to her name. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You must be mistaken, or you're crazy," he shouted at the security chief. "I paid a fortune to rent this hall. I have the right to throw out anyone I please." His laughter choked in his throat as Mrs. Eleanor Vance emerged from behind Sarah's wheelchair. The old woman strode forward, carrying a cane topped with a platen, carved dragon's head. She looked at Mark with utter disdain, as if he were something she'd scraped off her shoe. In a calm but powerful voice, Mrs. Vance revealed the hidden truth. She explained that the land and the building on it belonged to Sarah's family, based on a legal deed that had been embezzled by Mark's own late father. Tonight, all proof of ownership had been returned to its rightful heir. Mrs. Vance looked Mark dead in the eye. "So tell me," she asked with a cynical sneer, "who is the real freeloader here? Who is the real parasite living off someone else's fortune?" Mark's face turned beet red with shame and rage. The tables had turned completely. From the arrogant host, he was now an unwelcome guest on property, owned by the wife he had just cast out. The realization that Sarah was the owner of this luxurious venue was a catastrophic loss of face. The whispers of the place and his guests swelled into a buzzing hive of gossip. They now looked at Mark with suspicion and contempt. The reputation he had spent years building was crumbling. In minutes, Mark knew he couldn't argue about the building's ownership. Mrs. Vance's confidence, backed by the security chief, was unshakable, so he decided to attack from a different angle, one he was sure would destroy Sarah's dignity completely. The status of the baby, Leo. He scrambled back onto the stage and snatched the microphone from the stunned MC. Breathing heavily, he tried to divert everyone's attention. He pointed a trembling finger at the sleeping baby in Sarah's lap. Money and buildings can't hide the fact that she's a cheating whore, he screamed. He repeated his accusation that Leo was illegitimate. With great theatricality, Mark pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his suit pocket. He claimed it was a medical report from a top doctor, stating that he had been left permanently sterile after a car accident 5 years ago. He held the paper high for all to see. How? He asked the crowd, his voice trembling with feigned anguish. Could she possibly have gotten pregnant and given birth if her husband is sterile? The only logical conclusion, he argued, was that Sarah had slept with another man. The vile accusation shocked the room. Sarah could only bow her head, clutching Leo even tighter. Tears streamed down her face, not of guilt, but of disbelief, that the man she once loved could be so cruel as to slander his own flesh and blood just to save face. Seeing Sarah's silent tears, Mark felt a surge of victory. He had turned public, opinion back in his favor. He smirked, triumphant. But his smile didn't last. Mrs. Vance, who had remained calm, now stepped forward. She signaled to her assistant, who handed her another microphone. Her voice, crisp and sharp, cut through the murmurs. A lie can run, but the truth will always catch up, she announced. She asked everyone to remain calm and witness the real proof. Without hesitation, Mrs. Vance asked Sarah to gently open the blanket wrapped around Leo. Carefully, Sarah revealed her baby's tiny upper arm. There, on his left shoulder, was a unique birthmark, a reddish-brown mark, shaped distinctly, like a crescent moon. Mrs. Vance had a camera operator zoom in on it, projecting the image onto the large screen behind the stage for everyone to see. Then, Mrs. Vance turned to Mark. With an undeniable tone of command, she told, "Want him to roll up his left shirt sleeve." Mark refused, hiding his arm behind his back, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "This is an invasion of my privacy. I won't do it," he yelled. But Mrs. Vance was relentless. She signaled to 2 large security guards, who promptly ascended the stage. Mark struggled, but he was no match for them. The sight was pathetic, the host of the party wrestling with his own security. They restrained him and forcibly rolled up the sleeve of his expensive suit and shirt. In the next second, a collective gasp swept through the room. There, on Mark's left shoulder, in the exact same spot as on his son, was an identical crescent moon-shaped birthmark. The shape, the color, the position, it was a perfect duplicate. Mrs. Vance smiled victoriously. She explained to the stunned audience that this birthmark was a rare and dominant genetic trait, passed directly from father to son. It was natural DNA evidence that no paid-for medical report could ever disprove. She then revealed the final medical truth. The sterility diagnosis Mark clung to was a fake, procured by a doctor who had tried to blackmail him. In reality, Mark had fully recovered from his injuries over a year ago without even realizing it. Her words pierced Mark's heart. He stared at the birthmark on his own arm, then at the giant screen showing the one on Leo. The crushing realization hit him. The baby he had just thrown out into a storm, the child he had publicly branded as a bastard and a curse, was truly his own son, his own flesh and blood, his only heir. He had just disowned his own child in front of hundreds of witnesses. Shame, regret, and terror mingled, making his knees buckle. He collapsed onto the stage floor as the gazes of the guests turned from suspicion to absolute disgust. He wasn't just a cheat. He was a father who had committed the ultimate sin against his own child. The whispers in the ballroom intensified, turning into an angry buzz. The guests, who had once admired Mark, now stared at him with contempt and disgust. The public denial of his own child had demolished any semblance of morality he had projected, but Mark wasn't ready to give up. He staggered to his feet, dusting off his expensive suit with a rough motion. His face, red with fury, tilted up to challenge the hundreds of judging eyes. His personal reputation was ruined. He knew, but he still had his trump card. His wealth. In his world, money could fix anything, including a tarnished name. Mark grabbed the microphone again. His voice, though trembling with rage, was loud. He yelled at the guests not to be fooled by the old woman's stories. He conceded there might have been a medical misunderstanding, but it didn't change the fact that he was a successful, self-made businessman. He beat his chest proudly, declaring that this party was funded by his own hard work, not some inheritance. He pointed a dismissive finger at Sarah. She may have an old piece of paper, he sneered. But this building, this empire, it's all mine. Without me, that land is just a worthless empty lot. He warned the investors in the room that if they sided with Sarah, they would lose their most profitable business partner. Mrs. Vance listened to his rant with a placid expression, as if enduring a boring bedtime story. When he finished, she didn't waste time arguing. She gave a subtle nod to her assistant near the AV booth. The large screen behind the Serenit stage flickered. The image of the birthmark was replaced by a giant financial chart, its red lines plunging downward in a catastrophic dive. It was the dawn balance sheet for Mark's company. The numbers were staggering. The profit column was empty, while the debt column had swelled into the millions of dollars. The guests, many of whom were his business partners, stared in horror as the company's dirty laundry was aired for all to see. Mrs. Vance stepped onto the stage, her charisma commanding the room. She explained loudly that what Mark boasted of as a business empire was nothing more than a house of cards, a scheme of robbing Peter to pay Paul. The investments he paraded were just money from new loans used to pay off old debts. His lavish lifestyle, the fancy car, the designer watch, and this very party, all funded by borrowed money he could never repay. Mark stood frozen, his face ashen. His deepest financial secrets were now public knowledge. He tried to scream that the data was fake, but Mrs. Vance cut him off with an even more devastating revelation, one that made Sarah gasp in her wheelchair. Mrs. Vance revealed that Mark had been deviously clever in hiding his impending bankruptcy. With his own credit ruined, he had been taking out massive new loans in someone else's name. Sarah's. The screen changed again, displaying scanned copies of loan agreements. Sarah's name was clearly listed as the primary borrower, fully liable for all the debts. Her signature was on every page. Sarah covered her mouth, her body shaking. She remembered. A few months ago, while she was heavily pregnant and often unwell, Mark would bring her stacks of papers to sign, claiming they were for household administration or routine, banking. Trusting him completely, she had signed everything without reading. Mrs. Vance looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and resolve. She announced that Mark hadn't just thrown her out. He had been planning to have her thrown in prison for his debts. His scheme was to pile debt onto her name, then divorce her, leaving her to face the collectors and the courts while he walked away, scotangent-free. The plan was so meticulously cruel. Sarah felt a crushing weight on her chest. This was a betrayal beyond infidelity. Mark wasn't just a bad husband. He was a criminal who would sacrifice his own wife and child to save himself. The party descended into chaos. Investors, realizing their money was gone, began, shouting angrily, surging toward the stage to confront Mark. He backed away in terror, cold sweat pouring down his face. He was cornered. At that moment, a side door to the ballroom opened. 2 uniformed police officers entered, followed by a man in a suit carrying a thick briefcase, lawyer from the bank. The officers ascended the stage and read from a warrant, arresting Mark not for domestic abuse, but for multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Mark shook his head frantically, looking for an escape, but every exit was blocked by the furious crowd he had swindled. Cornered and desperate, his survival instincts took over. His panicked eyes darted around, searching for a Poncis savior. They landed on the beautiful woman standing near him on the stage. Jessica, his fiancée, the supposed daughter of a powerful official. He was certain her father's influence could make this all go away. He scrambled over to Jessica, grabbing her arm. "Call your father, now," he pleaded. "Fix this. It's all a lie. I'll explain later." But Jessica's reaction was not what he expected. She showed no panic, no sorrow. Her beautiful face, usually adorned with a playful smile, was now a cold, hard mask of indifference. With a surprisingly strong movement, she wrenched her arm, free from his grasp. She looked at him with undisguised disgust and took a step back, as if he were contagious. Mark stared, bewildered by the sudden change in the woman who had been whispering sweet nothings to him just hours before. "What are you doing?" he croaked. "They're arresting your future husband." Without a word to Mark, Jessica turned and walked toward Mrs. Vance and Sarah. The click of her high heels on the stage floor was the only sound in the silent room. She stopped before Mrs. Vance, gave a slight, respectful nod, then reached into her glittering clutch. She pulled out a small silver flash drive and handed it to Mrs. Vance. The act left everyone, especially Mark, dumbfounded. He struggled to understand the connection between his fiancée and his greatest enemy. Mrs. Vance took the flash drive with a faint smile, then looked back at the gaping Mark. She proceeded to introduce the real Jessica. She wasn't the daughter of a powerful official. Her father was a retired school teacher from a small town. Jessica was a professional private investigator, hired by Mrs. Vance 6 months ago. Her mission: to infiltrate Mark's life, make him fall for her, and gather irrefutable evidence of his financial crimes and his vile plans from the inside. The whirlwind romance, the lavish engagement, all of it was just an elaborate trap, set to spring when his arrogance was at its peak. Mark felt his knees give out, and he collapsed to the floor once more. His entire relationship had been a lie. He had been completely and utterly played. Jessica then took the microphone. Her voice was crisp and professional, a world away from the coy tone she used with Mark. She revealed one final, horrifying fact. Inside Mark's briefcase in the VIP dressing room was a small packet of illegal drugs. She explained that Mark wasn't a user. He had bought the drugs to plant in Sarah's belongings. His plan, after throwing her out, was to anonymously tip off the police, ensuring Sarah would rot in prison and lose custody of their child, freeing him from any and all responsibility forever. This confession sent a wave of shock and horror through the room. Financial crimes were one thing, but plotting to frame the mother of your own child with narcotics was a level of evil that was unforgivable. Sarah, hearing this, hugged Leo so tightly he stirred. Tears of terror streamed down her face as she imagined what would have happened if Mrs. Vance hadn't intervened. Jessica then played an audio recording from her phone over the ballroom's sound system. Mark's voice, clear as day, was heard laughing with someone on the phone about his plan to get rid of the trash, referring to Sarah and how he'd already acquired the evidence to frame her. There was no denying it. Mark, now kneeling on the stage, looked like a man who had lost his mind. His face was a deathly pallor, his eyes wild. He knew there was no way out. The woman he thought was his trophy was actually his executioner. The police officers moved in, their handcuffs glinting under the stage lights. Mark scrambled backward on the floor, shaking his head hysterically, screaming that it was all a setup. But the evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Vance watched the scene with grim satisfaction. She leaned down to Sarah and whispered, "This is how you destroy a wicked man. Not with violence, but by letting him dig his own grave with his greed and his lies." The engagement party that was meant to be Mark's coronation had become his public execution. He was truly alone, betrayed by his own ambition, and surrounded by the enemies of his own making. The situation in the grand ballroom spiraled into chaos. The world was collapsing around Mark. The police advanced, their boots echoing on the marble floor, each step a countdown to the end of his freedom. He scrambled backward, eyes darting for an escape, but all exits were blocked. His breath came in ragged gasps. In a final, desperate panic, his eyes locked onto a fruit platter on a nearby table. Lying next to it was a sharp, silver knife. His cunning mind, fueled by a primal need to survive, took over. Without a second thought, he lunged for the knife. The sudden movement made the officers pause and draw their weapons. Guests screamed as the blade flashed in his hand, but Mark wasn't targeting the police. His eyes fixed on a much softer, more valuable target, his only bargaining chip. Near the edge of the stage, one of Mrs. Vance's trusted female assistants was holding the bundled-up baby. "Everybody back off!" Mark shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. In a desperate move, he lunged at the assistant, roughly grabbing her and snatching the baby from her arms. Before anyone could react, he had backed himself against a wall, holding the silver knife to the bundle in his left arm. Sarah screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. A surge of adrenaline shot through her weak body. She tried to rise from her wheelchair, but the pain was too intense, and she collapsed back into the seat. Mark grinned maniacally, seeing the fear in everyone's eyes. He felt in control. Again. He demanded a car, fully fueled, at the main entrance, and a clear path Out! He swore he wouldn't hesitate to use the knife if his demands weren't met. In 5 minutes, an icy silence fell over the room. The police lowered their weapons, trying to negotiate. Sarah sobbed, begging him not to hurt Leo. Mrs. Vance, her face taut, raised a hand to signal the police to hold their positions. Mark thought he had won. He began to inch sideways toward an exit, dragging his feet. The knife held steady. But amidst the tension, he noticed something strange. The baby in his arms was completely still. There was no crying, no squirming, despite the chaos. The bundle felt stiff and a little too heavy for a newborn. Suspicion crept into his mind. He glanced down, peeling back a corner of the plainer, thick blanket. His heart stopped. He had been tricked. He wasn't holding Leo. He wasn't holding a human baby at all. Staring back at him was the placid face of a hyper-realistic silicone doll. A high-quality reborn doll. Mrs. Vance had anticipated his desperation. The real Leo had been quietly taken out a back exit to a secure room moments earlier. This was just a decoy. The realization shattered Mark's focus. The hand holding the knife trembled. That split second of his distraction, a mother's fury overrode Sarah's physical pain. Seeing Mark frozen, staring at the doll, she acted. She spotted Mrs. Vance's dragon-headed cane, leaning against a table beside her. With the last ounce of her strength, Sarah grabbed the heavy cane, forced herself to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her abdomen, and swung it with all her might at Mark's hand. There was a sickening crack of wood against bone. Mark howled in agony. The knife flew from his grasp, clattering onto the marble floor. He stumbled and fell, the doll rolling away from him. Before he could recover, 3 police officers were on him, pinning him to the police officers were on him, floor, wrenching his hands behind his back, and snapping handcuffs onto his plecker quinks, wrists. The click was a sound of finality. He thrashed like a caged animal. But it was useless. He was defeated, humiliated, and now, officially, a prisoner. Mark lay with his face pressed to the cold floor, the knee of an officer in his back. He was broken. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes, red with rage and frustration, finding Mrs. Vance. The old woman approached slowly, the plast tap, tap, tap of her cane echoing in the quiet room. "Who are you?" Mark screamed at her, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this? Who the hell are you to destroy my life?" He couldn't understand her motive. Her meticulously planned, devastating revenge. Mrs. Vance stopped in front of him. She signaled for the officer to let him sit up. She stared down at his face, her own expression filled with an ancient, unhealed wound. Slowly, she raised a hand to her own cheek, touching a faint, silvery scar near her ear, the remnant of an old burn. "Do you truly not recognize your own mother, Marcus?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Or has your heart become so blinded by greed that you've forgotten the woman who gave birth to you?" The word mother struck Mark like a physical blow. He stared, his eyes wide, with disbelief. He shook his head. No. His mother was a poor, sickly woman. He had abandoned in a cheap state-run nursing home 5 years ago. This elegant, powerful woman couldn't be her. "You're lying," he croaked. "My mother is dead, or rotting in that hellhole." The casual cruelty of his words made even the hardened guests flinch. A tear escaped Mrs. Vance's eye. But her face remained strong. She told him the story. 5 years ago, he had indeed abandoned her. He had forged her death certificate to claim he was an orphan so he could marry his first wealthy wife. Long before, Sarah, he was ashamed of his mother, a former housekeeper, but fate had other plans. The nursing home had a terrible fire. Many residents died. But she survived, rescued by a distant relative of her late husband who had been searching for her for decades. That relative, childless, left her their entire fortune. With her new wealth, she underwent reconstructive surgery for her burns, transformed her appearance, and set out with one goal: to find her only son. She had wanted to forgive him, to embrace him. Instead, she found a monster. She discovered him conning investors and tormenting his kind, gentle wife, Sarah. She had hired the investigator, orchestrated this entire night, not out of hatred, but as a last, desperate attempt to teach a lesson to the son who had lost his soul. She leaned down close to his face. "I give my blessing to Sarah and to Leo, my grandson," she whispered. "But as for you, I no longer have a son." She stood, tall. "Today, I am not a mother begging for her child's love. I am a judge, delivering a sentence." She had already legally removed him from any family, inheritance. All of it, the land, the buildings, the money, would go directly to Leo, with Sarah as his guardian. Mark would not get a single penny. A primal howl of terror and despair ripped from Mark's throat. It wasn't the cry of a repentant son, but of a man terrified of poverty and prison. He lunged for her feet, crying, "Mom, Mom, please, I'm sorry. Don't let them take me." But it was too late. Mrs. Vance pulled her leg back and turned away, refusing to look at him any longer. "Take him away," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I do not have a criminal for a son." The police dragged Mark out of the ballroom, his pleas echoing behind him, followed by the contemptuous stares of hundreds who had just witnessed the fall of a man who had disowned his mother and his son. For Sarah, watching the back of the man who had been her husband disappear, it felt as if a great, heavy weight was finally being lifted from her shoulders. 2 months later, Mark was in a cramped, damp, foul-smelling prison cell. His designer suits were replaced by a coarse, faded blue jumpsuit. His once perfectly styled hair was gone. His head shaved, revealing nicks and scratches from fights with other inmates. Many of them were thugs hired by the very businessmen he had swindled. He was their punching bag. He ate last, slept on the floor near the toilet, and lived in constant fear. The leg Sarah had struck with the cane had never healed properly and was now permanently damaged from constant beatings, leaving him with a painful, shuffling limp. One afternoon, a guard called his name. A visitor. Hope surged through him. Maybe his lawyer, or maybe his mother. He was led, handcuffed, to the Fromenat.org visitation room. He squinted as he sat on the cold metal stool, separated by a thick pane of glass from the outside world. The door opened, and Sarah walked in. She looked radiant, calm, and strong, dressed in a simple, elegant outfit. In her arms, a chubby and healthy Leo gurgled happily. It was a portrait of the life he had thrown away. Mark pressed his hands to the glass, tears streaming down his grimy face. He begged for her forgiveness, swore he had changed, and pleaded with her to ask his mother to drop the charges. He groveled, reminding her of the good times, hoping to manipulate a shred of love that might still exist. Sarah listened silently. When he was finished, She calmly pulled a folder from her bag. She didn't respond to his pleas. Instead, she pressed a document against the glass. It was a final court order. Their divorce had been granted, but the next paragraph was the final blow. The court had awarded Sarah sole, legal and physical custody of Leo. Furthermore, due to Mark's criminal actions and his attempt to endanger his own child, the court had granted her motion for the complete and permanent termination of his parental rights. His name was to be legally removed from Leo's birth certificate. "I'm doing this to protect Leo's future," she said, her voice even through the Prosen intercom. "I won't let him carry the shame of having a father who is a convicted felon. A man who would throw away his own son," Mark screamed, pounding his cuffed fists against the glass. "He's my son. My..." Blood runs in his veins. Sarah stood up, adjusting Leo in her arms. She looked at Mark one last time. "Being a father is about more than blood," she said softly. "It's about love and responsibility. Two things you never understood." She turned and walked away, without looking back, leaving him howling her name as the guards dragged him back to the darkness of his cell. 5 years later, in a gleaming skyscraper in the city's financial district, Sarah sat in the city's financial district, corner office of the CEO. Under the mentorship of Mrs. Vance, now, happily, retired, she had grown the family's real estate firm into a major enterprise. She was also a renowned philanthropist, funding shelters for abused women. That evening, another storm rolled in, the rain lashing against her panoramic window. It reminded her of that night 5 years ago. The door opened, and a bright, handsome 5-year-old boy ran in. It was Leo. "Mommy, let's go. Grandma's making pasta." Sarah smiled, closed her laptop, and took her son's hand. Their private driver was waiting in the lobby with an umbrella. As their luxury car moved through the rain-soaked streets, it stopped at a red light in front of an upscale bakery. Huddled in the doorway, just out of the awning's protection, was a homeless man. His clothes were ragged and soaked, his hair long and matted. He was skeletal, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. He was begging from passers-by, who ignored him with disgust. Sarah squinted. Even through the grime and misery, she recognized him. The faint birthmark on his exposed left arm was unmistakable. It was Mark. He had recently been released from prison on parole for medical reasons. His assets were gone, his connections severed. He was truly, irrevocably, alone. Mark, shivering, saw the luxury car. The back window lowered slightly. His blurry eyes widened as he saw Sarah's face, and next to her, a handsome little boy. It had to be Leo. A wave of belated regret washed over him. He staggered to his feet, limping toward the car, shouting their names, claiming to be Leo's father. Leo looked at his mother, confused. "Mommy, who's that dirty man? Why is he yelling your name?" Sarah looked at Mark, not with hatred or revenge, but with the detached pity one would feel for a suffering stranger. She stroked Leo's hair. "He's just a confused man, sweetheart. A stranger." Her words, overheard through the open window, destroyed the last shred of Mark's hope. He was nothing. The light turned green. Before the window closed, Sarah got the attention of the bakery's security guard. She handed him a large bill, but not for Mark. "See that trash can over there?" she said to the guard. "There's usually a broken umbrella in it. Please give it to that man." It was a final, symbolic message. He had thrown her out into the rain with nothing. Now, she was giving him the same useless, broken protection he had once offered her. The car drove away. The guard, confused, found the tattered, broken-ribbed umbrella and handed it to Mark. He took it with a trembling hand, standing alone, on the sidewalk as the rain poured down, unable to shield him. The water washed over his body, mingling with the endless, silent tears of regret as he watched the taillights of his former life disappear around a corner, leaving him forever. In the cold and the dark, karma had finally and fully been served.